June 28, 2024, the day Venezuela lost its future without a shot fired. Let me tell you about the moment I realized the game was over for Venezuela. It wasn't the day Nicolas Maduro claimed victory in a sham election. It wasn't the day the U.S. Treasury announced another round of sanctions, or even when the last American oil commies packed up and left. No, it was the quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the language coming out of Beijing and Moscow in late June, a shift so subtle that most analysts missed it, buried as it was beneath layers of diplomatic jargon and economic data. I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of petrostates. And what I saw in those few days wasn't just another chapter in Venezuela's long decline. It was the final act of a geopolitical play that had been written years ago, executed with such precision that Caracas didn't even realize it had already lost. Here's what the headlines told: Venezuela's oil production hits 20-year low. U.S. sanctions cripple Maduro regime. Opposition leader Maria Corina Machado gains international support. China and Russia stand by their ally. The story, as it was presented, was one of a rogue state clinging to power through brute force and foreign patronage, while the West, principled but frustrated, tightened the screws in the name of democracy. But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete. It's actively misleading. Let's start with the numbers. The U.S. State Department and the mainstream press would have you believe that Venezuela's oil industry is on life support, gasping under the weight of American sanctions. And yes, production has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to barely 700,000 today. But here's what they're not telling: Venezuela's oil isn't just declining. It's being reallocated. And not by Caracas. In the first quarter of 2024, China imported an average of 450,000 barrels per day from Venezuela, up 30% from the same period last year. Russia, meanwhile, has quietly become the largest re-exporter of Venezuelan crude, blending it with its own heavy oil to circumvent Western restrictions. The data doesn't. While U.S. sanctions have made it harder for Venezuela to sell oil on the open market, they haven't stopped the flow. They've just rerouted it directly into the hands of America's 2 biggest geopolitical rivals. Now, let's talk about the money. The official story is that Venezuela is broke, its economy in tatters, its people starving. And again, there's truth to that. Hyperinflation has destroyed the bolivar. The black market exchange rate is a joke. But here's where it gets: Venezuela's central bank still holds over $10 billion in gold reserves, most of it stored in vaults in London, New York, and, crucially, Moscow. And in April, the Bank of Russia quietly announced that it would begin accepting Venezuelan gold as collateral for new loans, denominated in yuan. Do you see the pattern yet? The sanctions weren't designed to collapse Venezuela. They were designed to redirect it. To make it dependent. To ensure that when the inevitable transition comes, it's not to a pro-Western democracy, but to a client state of the emerging multipolar order. And that's where the real story begins. The great power: how Venezuela became a pawn in the new Cold War. Let me be: this isn't about Maduro. It's not even really about Venezuela. It's about the slow, grinding death of American unipolarity and the rise of a world where power is measured in spheres of influence, not universal values. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that its economic and military dominance would allow it to reshape the world in its image. The Washington Consensus, the War on Terror, the pivot to Asia, all of it was built on the idea that liberal democracy and free markets were the inevitable end state of human political evolution. But here's the hard: that era is over. And Venezuela is one of the clearest examples of what comes in. China and Russia didn't save Venezuela out of altruism. They did it because they saw an opportunity to erode American power in what Zbigniew Brzezinski once called the soft underbelly of the Western Hemisphere. And they've played the long game with a patience that Washington, in its hubris, has never matched. Let's rewind to 2019. The Trump administration, in a fit of what can only be described as geopolitical malpractice, recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president. The move was supposed to trigger a cascade of defections within the military, a popular uprising, and the swift collapse of the Maduro regime. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. The military stayed loyal. The opposition fractured. And China and Russia doubled down, offering Maduro a lifeline in the form of loans, oil swaps, and most critically, diplomatic cover at the United Nations. Fast forward to 2024. The Biden administration, desperate to avoid another foreign policy failure ahead of the election, has quietly walked back its support for Guaido. The sanctions remain, but the rhetoric has softened. Why? Because the White House has finally realized what Beijing and Moscow figured out years: Venezuela isn't a country to be fixed. It's a bargaining chip. Here's how the game is being played. China gets Venezuela's oil at a discount, paid for in yuan, a direct challenge to the dollar's dominance in global energy markets. Russia gets a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a place to park its Wagner Group mercenaries, and a testing ground for its hybrid warfare tactics. And the United States? It gets to pretend it still has leverage, while its actual influence in the region evaporates. But the real kicker? Neither Beijing nor Moscow actually wants Maduro to fall. A stable, democratic Venezuela would be a threat to their interests. A weak, dependent Venezuela is an asset. And that's why, when you look at the data, you realize something: the transition has already happened. The only question is whether Washington will admit it. The military: why no one wants a war. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the military situation. Because if you listen to the hawks in Washington, you'd think that a quick, surgical strike on Venezuela's oil infrastructure, or better yet, a full-blown regime change operation, would solve all of America's problems in the region. But here's the thing: they've never met a war they didn't like, and they've never learned from history. I've studied every major U.S. intervention of the last 50 years: Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and they all follow the same pattern. First, the intelligence is wrong. Then, the planning is optimistic. Then, the execution is a mess. And finally, the aftermath is a disaster. Venezuela would be no different. Let's start with the basics. Venezuela's military is a shell of what it once was, but it's still formidable. The country has over 100,000 active duty personnel, a stockpile of Russian and Chinese weapons, and most importantly, a population that, despite its suffering, still harbors deep resentment toward the United States. The idea that a few airstrikes or a limited invasion would topple Maduro without triggering a prolonged insurgency is fantasy. But here's where it gets even more complicated. China and Russia aren't just passive observers in this. They've been preparing for the possibility of U.S. intervention for years. In 2021, Russia deployed a contingent of S-300 air defense systems to Venezuela, along with a team of military advisors. China, meanwhile, has been quietly extending its presence at the Puerto Cabello naval base, where it's been conducting joint exercises with the Venezuelan Navy. Now, I'm not saying that Beijing or Moscow would directly intervene in a U.S.-Venezuela conflict. But they don't have to. All they need to do is make the cost of intervention so high that Washington thinks twice. And that's exactly what they've done. The real danger, though, isn't a direct confrontation between the US and Russia or China. It's the escalation ladder, the way a limited strike could spiral into something much bigger. Imagine this: the US bombs a Venezuelan oil refinery. Maduro retaliates by sinking a US oil tanker in the Caribbean. The US responds with a cyber attack on Venezuela's power grid. Russia, seeing an opportunity, offers to protect Venezuelan infrastructure with its own cyber capabilities. Suddenly, you're not just fighting Venezuela. You're fighting a proxy war with Moscow. And that's the nightmare scenario that keeps me up at night. Because in a multipolar world, every conflict is a linked conflict. Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about Taiwan. It's about Ukraine. It's about the future of the dollar. And the moment the US crosses the Rubicon in Caracas, it's not just Venezuela that reacts. It's the entire global system. The domestic political: why Venezuela is a distraction, not a priority. Here's something that might surprise: the US government doesn't actually care that much about Venezuela. Not really. Oh, they'll talk about democracy and human rights. They'll impose sanctions and give speeches at the UN. But when you strip away the rhetoric, what you're left with is a simple: Venezuela is a political tool, not a policy priority. Let me explain. In the lead up to the 2024 election, the Biden administration is facing a perfect storm of domestic inflation, border security, the war in Ukraine, the looming threat of a second Trump presidency. And in that context, Venezuela is useful in two ways. First, it's a wedge issue. The Venezuelan diaspora in Florida, over 500,000 strong, is a key voting bloc in one of the most important swing states in the country. By taking a hard line on Maduro, Biden can peel off some of the Cuban and Venezuelan voters who might otherwise be tempted to vote for Trump. It's cynical, but it's politics. Second, Venezuela is a distraction. Every minute the media spends talking about Maduro's latest human rights abuses is a minute they're not talking about the administration's failures in Ukraine, or the collapse of the border, or the fact that inflation is still eating away at American paychecks. And in an election year, distractions are currency. But here's the: when you treat foreign policy as a domestic political tool, you make terrible decisions. You impose sanctions that hurt ordinary people more than the regime. You recognize opposition leaders who have no real support inside the country. You talk tough but do nothing, because the last thing you want is an actual crisis. And that's exactly what's happened with Venezuela. The US has spent years playing a game of chicken with Maduro, assuming that at some point, he'll blink. But Maduro hasn't blinked. And now, the US is stuck with a policy that has no endgame. The sad truth is that Venezuela was never going to be a priority for the Biden administration. It's too far away, too complicated, and too risky. And that's why, when you look at the bigger picture, you realize something: even Venezuela was over before anyone in Washington even realized it was a game. The what comes next. So where do we go from here? Let's lay out the possibilities, because none of them are pretty. Scenario: the soft landing. In this best-case scenario, Maduro, facing mounting pressure from within his own coalition, agrees to a negotiated transition. The opposition, led by a unified front, takes power in a free and fair election. The US lifts sanctions, China and Russia grudgingly accept the new status quo, and Venezuela begins the long, painful process of rebuilding. But here's the: this scenario only works if everyone plays by the rules. And in a world where great powers are engaged in a zero-sum competition for influence, that's not going to happen. China and Russia would never allow a pro-Western government to take power in Caracas. They'd sabotage it at every turn. And the US, for its part, would never trust a transition that didn't put its own people in charge. So while this scenario is theoretically possible, it's also the least likely. Scenario: the frozen conflict. This is the most probable outcome. Maduro stays in power, but his regime becomes increasingly dependent on China and Russia for survival. The US keeps the sanctions in place, but they become a permanent feature of the landscape, like the embargo on Cuba. Venezuela's economy continues to stagnate, its people continue to suffer, and the country becomes a de facto client state of the emerging multipolar order. In this scenario, Venezuela isn't a failed state. It's a captured state, one that serves the interests of its patrons, not its people. And the US, having lost the initiative, is reduced to watching from the sidelines as its influence in the region erodes. Scenario: the collapse. This is the nightmare scenario. Maduro's regime, weakened by internal divisions and economic collapse, implodes. But instead of a smooth transition, you get chaos. The military fractures. Armed groups, some backed by Russia, others by the US, fight for control of the country's oil fields. Millions more Venezuelans flee, destabilizing Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. And in the midst of the chaos, China and Russia step in, not to restore order, but to exploit it. This is what happened in Libya after Gaddafi fell. This is what happened in Syria after Assad's regime nearly collapsed. And this is what will happen in Venezuela if the US and its allies aren't careful. Because in a multipolar world, collapse isn't an opportunity for democracy. It's an opportunity for predation. The grand strategy why America keeps losing the 21st century. At the heart of the Venezuela crisis is a much larger: the failure of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could reshape the world in its image through a combination of military power, economic coercion, and ideological hegemony. But that strategy has failed. Spectacularly. Let's look at the record. In the 1990s, the US tried to transform Russia into a liberal democracy. Instead, it got Putin. In the 2000s, it tried to bring democracy to the Middle East through regime change. Instead, it got Iraq, Syria, and Libya. In the 2010s, it tried to contain China through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Instead, it got a trade war and a new Cold War. And now, in the 2020s, it's trying to isolate Venezuela through sanctions. But all it's done is push Caracas into the arms of Beijing and Moscow. The problem isn't the tools. It's the assumptions. The US still believes that it can impose its will on the world through force and coercion. But in a multipolar world, that's no longer possible. Power is diffusing. Alliances are shifting. And the old rules no longer apply. What's needed is a new approach, one that recognizes the limits of American power and the realities of the 21st century. That means accepting that the world is no longer unipolar. It means engaging with rivals, not just confronting them. And it means focusing on interests, not ideals. But that's not the path we're on. Instead, we're doubling down on a strategy that has failed time and time again. And Venezuela is just the latest example of that failure. What should be a realist's playbook? So what's the alternative? Let me tell you what I would do if I were in charge. First, stop pretending that sanctions are a policy. They're not. They're a tactic, and a failed one at that. Sanctions don't topple regimes. They don't bring democracy. All they do is punish ordinary people and push governments into the arms of America's rivals. If the US wants to change Venezuela, it needs to offer Maduro a way out, not just a way to suffer. Second, engage with China and Russia. I know. This is controversial. But hear me out. The US doesn't have to like Beijing or Moscow to recognize that they have a stake in Venezuela's stability. And if the goal is to prevent a collapse, then the US needs to work with them, not against them. That means sitting down at the table and negotiating a grand bargain, sanctions relief in exchange for guarantees on oil exports, debt restructuring, and a transition plan. Third, focus on the region, not just Venezuela. The US has spent years obsessing over Caracas while ignoring the rest of Latin America. That's a mistake. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, these are the countries that will determine the future of the hemisphere. And if the US wants to counter Chinese and Russian influence, it needs to offer them something better than what Beijing and Moscow are offering. That means investment, trade, and most importantly, respect. Fourth, prepare for the worst. Because no matter what the US does, Venezuela's future is uncertain. And that means planning for the possibility of collapse. That means working with regional partners to manage migration flows. It means securing critical infrastructure. And it means ensuring that if Venezuela does implode, the US isn't caught flat-footed. Finally, be honest with the American people. The era of American hegemony is over. The world is becoming multipolar, and the US needs to adapt. That doesn't mean retreating into isolationism. It means recognizing that power is no longer absolute and that the US needs to pick its battles carefully. The end of the beginning. Let me leave you with Venezuela isn't just a country. It's a metaphor. A metaphor for the end of an era, the era of American dominance, of unipolarity, of the idea that the US could reshape the world in its image. The tragedy of Venezuela is that its people have suffered more than anyone else in this geopolitical game. But the real tragedy is that their suffering has been for nothing. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's collapse wasn't just an economic failure, it was a military one. And that's where the real geopolitical stakes lie. Because when a state loses its monopoly on violence, the consequences ripple far beyond its borders. We saw this in Syria, in Libya, in Somalia. But in Venezuela, the military's role is different. It's not just a tool of repression, it's a parallel economy, a shadow government, and in many ways, the last functioning institution in the country. That makes it both the problem and the solution. Let me explain why this matters.
The Venezuelan military isn't just a bunch of generals sitting in Caracas.
It's a sprawling network of officers, mid-level commanders, and even enlisted personnel who have spent the last decade turning the armed forces into a criminal enterprise. The numbers are staggering. According to Transparency International, Venezuela's military controls between 30% and 40% of the country's food imports, runs the state oil company's most lucrative smuggling routes, and has its fingers in everything from gold mining to drug trafficking.
The Cartel of the Suns, named after the gold stars on officers' epaulets, isn't some fringe operation.
It's the backbone of the regime's survival. Here's the uncomfortable: the US and its allies have spent years trying to peel the military away from Maduro, but they've done it all wrong.
Sanctions on individual officers? Pointless. The generals aren't keeping their money in Miami banks.
They're stashing it in AMA, Dubai, and yes, Moscow.
Threats of prosecution? Laughable.
These men know the International Criminal Court is a paper tiger when it comes to enforcing warrants in countries that don't recognize its jurisdiction.
And the idea that a few $1 million in humanitarian aid would convince them to switch sides? Naive. These aren't idealists.
They're pragmatists who have calculated that their best chance of survival is sticking with Maduro until the bitter end. But here's where it gets interesting.
The military isn't monolithic.
There are factions, hardliners who want to double down on repression, opportunists who are hedging their bets, and even a few who might be open to a negotiated exit if the price is right. The problem is that the US has never had a coherent strategy for exploiting those divisions. Instead, it's relied on blunt instruments, sanctions, indictments, and the occasional half-hearted coup attempt, none of which address the core of the military's economic interests. Take the case of General Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister. He's not just Maduro's enforcer, he's the gatekeeper of the military's illicit economy. In 2019, the US Treasury sanctioned him, freezing his assets and banning him from doing business with American entities.
Did it work? No.
Padrino just shifted his operations to Russia and China,
where he's still moving money through shell commies and state-backed banks.
The sanctions didn't hurt him, they just made him more dependent on Moscow and Beijing. Now, imagine if the US had taken a different approach.
What if, instead of sanctions, Washington had offered Padrino and his inner circle a way out?
Not amnesty, that's a non-starter, but a structured transition where they could keep a portion of their wealth in exchange for stepping aside.
It's not pretty, but it's how these things work. Look at South Africa's transition from apartheid. Look at Chile after Pinochet. The US has done this before. It just doesn't like to admit it.
The broader military implications are even more concerning. Venezuela's collapse has turned it into a magnet for foreign mercenaries, paramilitaries, and state-backed proxies.
The Russians have Wagner Group operatives embedded with the National Guard. The Iranians have Quds Force advisors training local militias. The Colombians have former FARC commanders running drugs across the border. And the Cubans? They're everywhere, advising the intelligence services, running the passport office, even managing the country's cyber defenses. This isn't just about influence. It's about control. Let me put this in perspective.
In 2020, the U.S. Southern Command estimated that Russia had deployed at least 100 military advisors to Venezuela, including specialists in air defense and electronic warfare. That same year, Iran sent 2 Boeing 747 cargo planes loaded with technicians and equipment to help restart Venezuela's refineries. And in 2021, the U.S. Treasury sanctioned a network of Lebanese Hezbollah operatives who were using Venezuela as a base for money laundering and drug trafficking.
This isn't a Cold War relic. It's a 21st century proxy war, and the US is losing.
The real danger isn't that Venezuela will become a Russian or Chinese client state. It's that it will become a failed state with nuclear-armed patrons.
Think about it.
Russia has already deployed nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela on multiple occasions. China has built a satellite tracking station in the country, which could be used for military purposes.
And Iran?
Well, let's just say that if Tehran ever decides to put a nuclear warhead on a ballistic missile, Venezuela would be a pretty convenient place to test it.
This is why the US can't afford to keep treating Venezuela as a sideshow.
The country is a ticking time bomb, and the clock is running out. The question isn't whether the regime will collapse, it's when, and what comes in. Will it be a managed transition, or a free-for-all? Will the military fracture along ideological lines, or will it hold together as a criminal syndicate? And most importantly, will the US be ready when the dam breaks? Here's what should keep policymakers up at night. Venezuela's collapse isn't just a humanitarian disaster. It's a national security threat. A failed state on the doorstep of the US would be a haven for terrorists, drug traffickers, and foreign intelligence services. It would destabilize Colombia, Brazil, and the entire Caribbean basin. And it would hand Russia, China, and Iran a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere. The US has spent the last 2 decades fighting wars in the Middle East. It can't afford to make the same mistake in Latin America. But if it doesn't act soon, it won't have a choice. The time for half measures is over. The US needs a real strategy, one that recognizes the military's role in Venezuela's survival, one that engages with regional partners, and one that prepares for the worst-case scenario. Because here's the thing about failed states. They don't stay failed. They metastasize. And when they do, the consequences are never contained. Venezuela isn't just a problem for Venezuela. It's a problem for the world. And the longer the US pretends otherwise, the worse it's going to get. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's collapse isn't just an economic or humanitarian crisis, it's a political one, and the rot runs far deeper than Maduro's mismanagement or Chávez's legacy. The real story isn't about socialism failing, it's about a state that stopped being a state a long time ago. The institutions we take for granted in functional democracies, courts, legislatures, even the military, have been hollowed out and repurposed as tools of control, not governance. And that's what makes this situation so dangerous. When the facade finally cracks, there won't be a functioning bureaucracy to pick up the pieces. There will just be power vacuums, and power vacuums in a country with Venezuela's resources and geopolitical position don't stay empty for long. Let me explain why this matters. Take the military, for example. The Bolivarian National Armed Forces aren't just a professional military, they're the backbone of the regime. Since Chávez took power in 1999, the military has been systematically politicized, rewarded with lucrative contracts, and embedded in every aspect of the economy. Today, the FANB controls everything from food distribution to oil exports, and its top brass are among the wealthiest men in the country. Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez, for instance, oversees a web of businesses that include everything from banking to mining, while the military's own oil company, Camimpeg, has been granted sweetheart deals to exploit Venezuela's reserves. This isn't corruption in the traditional sense, it's institutionalized kleptocracy, where the military's loyalty isn't to the state but to the network of patronage that keeps them rich. Here's the uncomfortable: the military isn't going to save Venezuela. It's going to be the reason Venezuela doesn't recover. The FANB has no incentive to push for a transition to democracy because democracy would mean accountability, and accountability would mean an end to their gravy train. That's why every time there's been a serious push for change, whether it was the 2019 uprising led by Juan Guaidó or the 2020 parliamentary elections, the military has closed ranks around Maduro. They're not ideologues, they're opportunists. And as long as the regime can keep them fed, they'll keep it propped up. But here's where it gets even more complicated. The military isn't a monolith. There are factions, and those factions are starting to fracture. On one side, you have the hardliners, the so-called Cartel of the Suns, a group of high-ranking officers deeply involved in drug trafficking, gold smuggling, and other illicit activities. These are the men who answer to Diosdado Cabello, the regime's second most powerful figure and the head of the Constituent Assembly, a body that exists solely to bypass the opposition-controlled National Assembly. Cabello's network is the real power behind Maduro, and they're the ones who would resist any transition that threatens their interests. On the other side, you have the more pragmatic officers, men like General Manuel Christopher Figuera, the former head of SEBIN, Venezuela's intelligence service, who briefly broke with Maduro in 2019 before fleeing to the US. These are the officers who recognize that the current path is unsustainable but aren't willing to risk their lives or their fortunes to push for change. They're waiting for a signal, a guarantee that they won't end up like Hugo Carvajal, the former military intelligence chief who was extradited to the US on drug charges in 2021.
The problem is, no one's giving them that signal.
The opposition is divided, the US is sending mixed messages, and the region is too distracted by its own crises to offer a coherent alternative. Now, let's talk about the opposition, because that's where the real tragedy of Venezuela's collapse lies. For years, the international community, particularly the US, has treated the opposition as if it were a government in waiting, a legitimate alternative to Maduro.
But the opposition isn't a government.
It's a collection of factions, each with its own agenda, and none of them have been able to present a unified front.
Take the 2024 presidential election, for example.
The opposition managed to unite behind a single candidate, Edmundo González Urrutia, a little-known diplomat who was essentially a placeholder for Maria Corina Machado, the real opposition leader. Machado won the opposition primary in 2023 with over 90% of the vote, but the regime barred her from running, so the opposition had to scramble to find someone else.
And even then, the election was a farce. The regime controlled the Electoral Council, banned opposition observers, and used state resources to campaign for Maduro.
When the results were announced, declaring Maduro the winner with 51% of the vote, no one believed them, not even the regime's allies. The opposition claimed González won with 67%, and the evidence, including leaked voting tallies, backed them up.
But what did that get them? Nothing. The US and its allies condemned the election, but they didn't recognize González as the winner.
The regime doubled down, arresting opposition figures and threatening to dissolve the National Assembly.
And just like that, the opposition's moment of unity collapsed. Here's why the opposition's failure isn't just a political problem, it's a strategic one.
The US and its allies have spent years trying to force a transition in Venezuela, but they've never had a plan B. Every time the opposition fails, the regime tightens its grip, and the military digs in deeper. The 2019 strategy, recognizing Guaidó as interim president, imposing sanctions, and hoping for a military coup, was a gamble, and it failed. The 2024 strategy, supporting a unified opposition candidate and hoping for a free and fair election, was another gamble, and it failed too.
The problem isn't the strategy, it's the assumption that the opposition can actually govern. They can't.
Not because they're incompetent, but because the regime has spent 25 years dismantling every institution that could make governance possible. The courts are stacked, the legislature is a rubber stamp, and the military answers to Cabello, not the Constitution. Even if Maduro were to step down tomorrow, the opposition would inherit a shell of a state, and the military would still call the shots.
So where does that leave us? With a few possible scenarios, none of them good.
The first is the status Maduro clings to power, the economy continues to deteriorate, and the country becomes even more of a narco-state. This is the most likely outcome in the short term, because it's the one that benefits the military and the regime's inner circle. The second scenario is a slow-motion collapse, where the regime loses control of the periphery, states like Zulia or Takira, which are already effectively run by armed gangs, and the country fractures into warlordism. This is what happened in Libya after Gaddafi, and it's a real possibility in Venezuela, given the proliferation of armed groups like the Tren de Aragua and the ELN, a Colombian guerrilla group that operates freely in Venezuelan territory. The third scenario is a military coup, but not the kind the US might hope for. If the hardliners around Cabello decide Maduro is a liability, they could replace him with someone like Padrino López, who would be just as authoritarian but more competent. And the fourth scenario, the one no one wants to talk about, is a full-blown civil war, where the military splits along factional lines and the country descends into chaos. Now, let's be none of these scenarios are inevitable. But they're all possible, and the longer the international community pretends that Venezuela is just another political crisis, the more likely the worst-case scenarios become. The US has to stop treating Venezuela as a diplomatic problem and start treating it as a national security threat.
That means three things.
First, it means recognizing that the military is the key to any transition, and that means offering incentives, not just threats, to the pragmatic officers who might be willing to break with the regime.
Second, it means working with regional partners like Colombia and Brazil to contain the fallout from Venezuela's collapse, because if the country implodes, the shockwaves will hit them first.
And third, it means preparing for the possibility that Venezuela could become a failed state, because if that happens, the US will have to deal with the consequences, whether it likes it or not. Here's the bottom: Venezuela isn't just a problem for Venezuelans. It's a problem for the hemisphere, and the longer we ignore it, the worse it's going to get. The regime isn't going to collapse on its own, and the opposition isn't strong enough to force a transition. The military isn't going to save the country, and the international community isn't going to solve the problem with sanctions or diplomacy. The only way out is a managed transition, and that requires a level of coordination and commitment that no one has been willing to muster. But if we don't start now, we'll be dealing with the consequences for decades. And by then, it'll be too late.